In the name of God, in this session I want to review the linguistic schools, linguistics in the first half of the 20th century. At first, we will read about the 20th century linguistic versus the 19th century linguistic continuance and breakthrough. Okay, at first we will read about them, the 20th century versus the 19th century linguistic, the contrast, their improving their breakthroughs. It is widely held opinion that the 19th century has been the century of comparative and historical linguistics. The 19th century, dear student, in this session we will read many points, which all of them are important, and we told you about them in the previous session, about some of them in the previous sessions. You should know them. For example, in the 19th century, we were concerned with the comparative and historical linguistics. I want to repeat it again because it is important. That time was the time of New Grammarian. In the 19th century, which we were dealing with the comparative and historical linguistics, and the 20th century, that of general or theoretical linguistics. In the 20th century, we were dealing with the general or theoretical linguistics. Such an opinion is certainly not ungrounded, but it needs some qualification. Historical comparative grammar was not the only subject investigated by 19th century linguistics. As a matter of fact, many of them deal with topics that one would certainly label today of general linguistics. Okay, in the 19th century, many of that researchers were dealing with some matters which we call them as we consider them as a general linguistics. At this point are from the Graphy 2006 in this page. Okay, here we will read these matters from the translated of matter from the original verse. Historical grammar took its rise from the older descriptive grammar and retains even now much from its predecessor. It has maintained, at least in the system of its classification, absolutely the old form. It has merely laid down a series of descriptive grammars parallel to each other. In fact, comparison and not explanation of development is regarded as, in the first instance, a proper characteristics of the new science. Descriptive grammar has to register the grammatical forms and grammatical conditions in use at a given date within a certain community speaking common language. To take note, in fact, of all that can be used by any individual without his being misunderstood and without his utterances seeming to him unusual. Its contents consist not in facts but merely in abstractions from observed fact. Another matter about this time are here. By comparing individual organisms of language, we obtain a certain average by which the strictly normal part of language, namely its usage, is defined. The result of this is that all the doctrine of the principles of the history of language centers round the question, what is the relation between linguistic usage and the individual linguistic activity? First, here, dear students, in this table, we read about the descriptive grammar versus historical grammar, individual linguistic activity versus linguistic usage. And this table, we told you about this matter: descriptive grammar, historical grammar, their differences with each other. We compare them with each other. At the first paragraph, we told you about the historical grammar, then we read about the descriptive grammar, and in following we read about individual linguistic activity and linguistic usage. Here. Okay. In this table, we will read about 3 meanings of the term language. 3 meanings of the term language. First, the language is considered as a phenomenon, as the respective means of expression for the respective thoughts. Okay, it is the respective means of expression for the respective thoughts, like as discourse or speech. Therefore, it is the respective means of expression for respective thoughts, like discourse or speech. Secondly, the language is regarded as a unified totality of such means of expression for any thoughts. In this sense, we speak of the language of people, of a professional group, of a writer, and etc. Therefore, when we consider this part of language, this meaning of language, which is regarded as a unified totality of such means or expression for any thoughts, and it means that we can express any thought by using language. Therefore, it is the language of people, of the professional group, of all of people. Finally, thirdly, we call language, as well as right and religion, a common property of a human being. This refers to the faculty of language, that is, the gift of expressing thoughts through language inherent to all nations. Here we read about the 3 meanings of the term language. And then we turn to Ferdinand de Saussure in 1857 to 1913. Saussure's life and work. You know, the book of Saussure, which was Course to Linguistic General, CLG. Ferdinand de Saussure in 1857 to 1913, born and educated in Geneva, subsequently studied historical comparative linguistics at the University of Leipzig, which in that epoch, at the end of the 1870s, was the center of the new grammarian school. Okay, you know, in the 19th century we will deal with new grammarian school, and that time in the Leipzig, this school was dominant. He obtained his PhD in 1880, but his scientific activity had already started a couple of years earlier, with a book devoted to the Indo-European vowel system, which published it in 1878. It was analyzed in a way no innovative that the book came to be fully appreciated by the scientific community only much later. After 10 years of teaching in Paris in 1891, Sorcerer became professor of Sanskrit and Indo-European languages at the University of Geneva, where he remained until his death. During his Geneva years, he became more and more uncertain about his ideas and his results, as it witnessed by the fact that his publications were increasingly rare. His fundamental aim was a consideration of the methods and the goals of linguistics, which you can read it in the original language, means to show the linguist what he is doing. As he wrote in a letter of 4 January 1894 to his colleague and former student Antony Millet, Sorcerer first presented his ideas on such matters during 3 courses in general linguistics, which he gave in the academic years at this time. Okay. Sorcerer's course to Linguistics General, his famous book in the 1922, was not directly written by him. It is important. I think you are familiar with this matter, that Sorcerer's course to Linguistics General, it means that his famous book in the 1922 was not directly written by him, but it was compiled by 2 former students, Charles Bailey and Albert Sechet, on the basis of the notes from class lectures given by Sorcerer in the academic years and this time at the University of Geneva. It is perhaps lesser known that neither Bailey nor Sechet attended any of such lectures. They simply reworked and systematized the notes which some other people has passed to them. As a result, their reconstruction is often considered not quite faithful to the authentic Sorcerian thought, especially after detailed studies of the handwritten notes by Gödel in the 1957 and their edition by Engler. Tolio de Maro's very detailed and insightful commentary on the course, which published since 1972 together with Sorcerer's original text, stresses many points of Sorcerer's original thinking, which were more or less modified by the editors. Today, the exact knowledge of Sorcerer's idea cannot therefore be gained without the support of the Maro's commentary or the attentive reading of Engler editions. Nevertheless, since only the Bailey-Sechet edition was available until 1960s, it was this text which actually influenced the immediately subsequent linguists. The novelty of Sorcerer's approach. The novelty of Sorcerer's approach. What distinguishes Sorcerer's thought from that of the preceding scholars is its systematic approach. Okay. What differentiates Sorcerer's from the preceding scholars is its systematic approach. Every linguistic unit can be defined only by virtue of the system of relations. Every linguistic unit can be defined only by virtue of the system of relations it has with the other units. It is important. It is the meaning of system in the Sorcerer viewpoint. Every linguistic unit can be defined only by virtue of the system of relation it has with the other units. Another characteristic feature of Sorcerer's thought is his attempt at building an autonomous linguistics, namely independent from psychology, sociology, or any other discipline, contrary to the methods of most linguistics immediately preceding him. Sorcerer's dichotomies, they are very important. One of the very important matters is Sorcerer's dichotomies. It is standard to summarize Sorcerer's thought by resorting to his four dichotomies, four pairs of concepts opposed to each other. We means by dichotomies we means pairs of concepts which oppose to each other. Dear student, they are very, very important, and you should know them exactly. Sorcerer's dichotomies. By dichotomies we means pairs of concepts which oppose to each other. It is standard to summarize Sorcerer's thought by resorting to his four dichotomies. Sorcerer expresses four dichotomies, means four pairs of concepts which oppose to each other. 1. Lang means language versus parole means speaking. Lang and parole means language speaking. Synchrony versus diachrony. I think you are familiar with this concept. Signifiant, it means signifier versus signified. Syntagmatic versus associative, later called paradigmatic relations. Syntagmatic versus associative, or another name for associative is paradigmatic, and I think paradigmatic is common. Syntagmatic versus paradigmatic, which is another name, is associative. Dear student, you should know these four dichotomies. They are very important. You should know their concepts, their meaning, and you should be able to mention them. Sorcerer has four dichotomies, has four concepts opposed to each other. Lang and parole means language and speaking. Synchrony versus diachrony. Signifier versus signified. Syntagmatic versus paradigmatic, which we called it as associative. Lang versus parole. Lang versus parole. Here we want to explain it, and then the following the table we will read more about that. Lang versus parole. In separating language from speaking, we means that we want to separate lang from parole. In separating language from speaking, we are at the same time separating. 1. What is social from what is individual? What is social from what is individual? And 2. What is essential from what is accessory and more or less accidental? Speaking, on the contrary, is an individual act. Speaking or parole is an individual act. It is willful and intellectual. Within the act, we should distinguish between the combinations by which the speaker uses the language code for expressing his own thought, and 2. The psychophysical mechanism that allows him to exteriorize those combinations. Okay, here we will read more about them. It's from the Sorcerer book. The opposition between Lang and Perel, as introduced in the Sorcerer 1922, appears somewhat oversimplified with respect to its handwritten sources. In its class lectures, Sorcerer actually distinguished not two concepts, but three: langue, parole, and language and langage. The last, which is langage, the last concept is not only presented as a purely many-sided and heterogeneous phenomena, but in a more positive way also as the faculty which allows humans to acquire any language. Okay, language considered as the faculty which allows humans to acquire any language. And Sorcerer also speak of faculty of language, a concept which appears rather close to the homonymous Chomskyan one. Another dichotomies are synchrony and diachrony. Dear students, we read about this dichotomy, but here we want to review them and maybe complete them with this matter. Synchrony and diachrony designates, respectively, a language state and an evolutionary phase. In itself, this opposition was nothing new. The difference between Sorcerer and earlier linguists, therefore, lies in the respective views of the opposition between synchrony and diachrony. Traditional grammar almost totally ignored diachrony. Traditional grammar almost totally ignored diachrony. In the 19th century, historical comparative grammar subordinated synchrony to diachrony, stating that only a diachronic study of language can be really scientific. Sorcerer's position is wholly opposite. Those scholars which were the previous scholar from Sorcerer, they believed in diachronic studies, but Sorcerer stressed on synchronic study. And diachronic study means that when we are doing the studies about language, we are dealing with the historical studies, but in synchronic studies, we are dealing with just one time, and we ignore the historical studies. We're just dealing with the contemporary studies, not historical. It is evident that the synchronic point of view predominates, for it is the true and only reality to the community of speakers. And if the linguist take the diachronic perspective, he no longer observes language or langue, but rather a series of events that modify it. Sorcerer's opposition between synchronic and diachronic can be condensed in the following way. Synchronic facts are systematic and meaningful, but diachronic facts are isolated and without any goal. It is the view of sorcerers, and sorcerers believe in synchronic, not diachronic. Signifier and signified. The bond between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. The bond, the relation between signifier and signified is arbitrary. Since I mean by sign the whole that results from the associating of the signifier with the signified, I can simply say the linguistic sign is arbitrary, original emphasis. This is so-called doctrine of arbitrariness of linguistic sign, which has sometimes been misunderstood. First of all, It must be kept in mind that this doctrine not only states the relationship between a given sequence of sound, for example, book, on the one hand, and a given object, a pile of printed sheet, bound together, on the other hand, has no natural basis, since it derives from the convention such as a conventionalist conception of the linguistic sign can be found in many linguistics before Sorcerer and can be traced back at least to Aristotle treatise to interpretation. Sorcerer's conception is new and deeper. According to him, it means that according to Sorcerer, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is not in the first place a relationship between language and reality, but a relationship internal to language itself. Arbitrary and differential are two correlative qualities. In language, there are only differences without positive terms. Modern French mountain can have the same signification as English ship, but not the same value. Modern French mountain can have the same signification as English ship, but not the same value. And this for several reasons, particularly because in speaking of a piece of meat ready to be served on the table, English uses mutton and not sheep. The difference in value between sheep and mutton is due to the fact that sheep has beside it a second term while the French word doesn't. Syntagmatic versus associative relation, or syntagmatic versus a paradigmatic relation. They are the same. In discourse, on the one hand, words acquire relations based on the linear nature of language because they are chained together. This rules out the possibility of pronouncing two elements simultaneously. Combinations supported by linearity are syntax. The syntax is always composed of two or more consecutive units. For example, reread, human life, God is good, if the weather is nice, we'll go all. They are the relation between this word is syntagmatic. Outside discourse, on the other hand, words acquire relations of a different kind. Those that have something in common are associated in the memory, resulting in group marked by diverse relations. For instance, the French word enseignement, mean teaching, will unconsciously call to mind a host of other words. Means teach, acquaint, changement, and etc. All those words are related in some way. We see that the coordination formed outside discourse differ strikingly from those formed inside discourse. They are associative relation. The sentence, which is the ideal type of syntax, belongs to speaking, not to language. To language rather than to speaking belong to syntagmatic type that are built upon regular forms. Sorcerer's heritage. Sorcerer's view of language paved the way to what was later called structural linguistics. Sorcerer's view of language paved the way to what was later called structural linguistics. Even if neither structure nor structural occur throughout Saussure takes, in a technical sense, the systemic approach to language and the definition of linguistic notions and categories on a purely linguistic basis without reference to psychological categories and so on, became the starting point of the structural linguistics. European schools of structural linguistics, the schools of Geneva, Prague, and Copenhagen. Dear students, we consider Saussure as a founder of structuralism or structural linguistics. And following the structural linguistics, the European schools of structural linguistics, which comes following Saussure's. European schools of structural linguistics, the schools of Geneva, Prague, and Copenhagen. They are structural linguistics. Geneva, a school of Geneva, Prague, and Copenhagen. Some common features of this school. The schools of linguistics most directly influenced by Saussure's thought differ considerably from each other, and such a differentiation often occurs even among scholars belonging to the same school. However, they share some significant ideas about the nature of language and the aims and the method of linguistics, which are essentially a critical development of some Saussurian basic insights. One such idea is the conception of the language as a structure. Another consistent development of Saussure's idea by the European schools of structural linguistics, which marks their difference with respect to most preceding trends, is the abandonment of psychologism. According to such linguists, language has to be described only on the basis of its structure and its functions, without any reference to psychological entities or processes. This psychologistic attitude fully characterizes the Prague and the Copenhagen school, while some remnants of psychologism can still be detected among Geneva scholars. Geneva School, some name for Geneva School. Charles Bailey in 1865 to 1947, Albert Sechet in 1870 to 1946, Henry Frey in 1899 to 1980. Okay, some names in Geneva School: Bailey, Sechet, and Frey. Bailey and Sechet were Saussure's students. Some ideas. Dear student, it is very good, this handbook, because it summarizes the important point for you. For example, you know about the persons in the Geneva school, Bailey, Sechet, and Frey. What about their ideas? Bailey's and Sechet's connection with Saussurian linguistics is shown by their residual links to 19th century psychologism. Bailey and Sechet's, which I told you they were Saussure students, connection with Saussurian linguistics is shown by their residual links to 19th century psychologism. Decidedly psychologistic attitude characterizes Sechet's first book. After the appearance of Saussure's course, Sechet also turned to more general problems such as the relationship between the social and the individual sides of language. Detaching himself from Saussure's concept of langue, intended as a common code shared by a community of speakers, he denied the legitimacy of assuming an entity of a language in itself over and above the languages of the individuals. Bailey's psychologism is especially to be found in the opposition between what he called the intellectual and the affective components of language. Bailey calls the discipline which has to deal with the combined effect of both the intellectual and the affective side of language stylistic. In his sense, therefore, stylistic is not limited to the analysis of literary texts. Like to say John, I cannot bear him, stylistically differs from I can't bear John. The intellectual content is the same, but the affective element is stronger in the first sentence than the second. Bailey reshapes the opposition between langue and parole. He defines parole as the actualization of langue. All elements of langue are virtual and to be applied to the reality that they have to be actualized, like book as an element of langue is a virtual concept which becomes phenomenon of actualization. Show that parole follow langue from the point of view which Bailey call static. From the genetic point of view, however, this relationship is reversed. Parole precedes langue in the genesis of language. Another school is Prague School. Some names are William Mathesius, which was the founder of Prague School. William Mathesius in 1882 to 1945. Sergei Karsvesky, 1884 to 1955. Nikolai Trotsky in the 1819 to 1938. Roman Jakobsen in the 1896 to 1982. Okay, you should know about the important persons in Prague School. Mathesius, which was its founder, Karsvesky, Trotsky, and Jakobsen. Mathesius' functionalism. Mathesius opposed the actual to the grammatical analysis of sentence. The latter is the traditional analysis into subject and predicate. The former subdivides the sentence into a theme and enunciation, later called rhyme. Both analyses are necessary in Mathesius' view, since they don't always coincide. The theme is not always identical with the grammatical subject, nor the rhyme with the grammatical predicate. The differences are also cross-linguistic. Modern English tend to make the subject coincide with the theme much more than do languages like Czech. This explains why one say "I like it" into the English, while in medieval English it was said me likes. In Czech and Italian, the grammatical predicate, when it is the theme of a sentence that is the topic which the sentence speaks about, can safely precede the subject. An English sentence is at home, I am helped by my father. In Czech would sound like Italian, a case, mi aiuta mio padre. In the English sentence, the grammatical subject means I precedes the grammatical predicate subject is my father, which is instead the rhyme, namely what is said about the theme. In this case, what answers the question, at home who help you. Okay, I think it is enough to the Prague School at the 1928 International Congress of Linguistics. I think it is enough until this matter. And in this session, we review some matters. The 20th century linguistic, its characteristics, its persons, and the 19th century linguistics, and their ideas, their principles, their important names. Which in the 19th century, which we were dealing with comparative on historical linguistics, but in 20th century we were dealing with the general and theoretical linguistics. We told you about the descriptive grammar versus historical grammar, individual linguistic activity versus linguistic usage. We explained them in this paragraph, in this the table. And we read about the Sorcerer ideas and principles, about his book, and about the Sorcerer Directiveness, which were 4, language versus parole or speaking, synchronic versus diachronic, signifier versus signified, and syntagmatic versus paradigmatic or associative. We read about them, and we gave you the important matter about each of them. Okay. Another matter was the social heritage, which here we stress on this matter that some schools like Geneva, Prague, and Copenhagen were formed following the Sorcerer's book, which in some matters they were common. They were the same with the Sorcerer ideas, and sometimes they were against him, which we told you about the Geneva schools and important name and ideas, and about the Prague school, the some names and ideas until this matter. The Prague school at the 1928 International Congress of Linguistics. Dear student, in this session, some of the matter are as a point. In this, you can summarize this session in this way that you can ignore the details about the matter. Just refer to the important point which we read about them previously, and I think some of them just remind you of the matter which you read in the previous session. Thank you. Please do your task and ask me your question. I try to guide you. Thank you.